Greetings everyone, my name is Jamie W. Wohn. Today I'm talking about schools and education, and we will be going over the sociological theory of symbolic interactionalism. We will also be talking about its pros and cons, its different ways of being implicated or analyzed within rural versus urban communities. I'll give examples of, or an example at least, of one career that this could be practically applied to, specifically mine, future career. I will give a situational example from my own experiences on how this can be applied. This will be explained in my story about my experience of the shift from Burton, Michigan to Frederick, Michigan, a more urban to a more rural region. And then we'll be talking about possibilities for change. Specifically, I'll give one example of a possibility for change and how I think it could be better applied based on the issues that come from these. And then I will list off 3 references I used in the making of this project. Symbolic interactionalism. Symbolic interactionalism is a sociological theory that analyzes things on a more one-on-one basis. It's a more micro versus macro type of analysis theory. The more specific example of this would be it analyzes people's one-on-one interactions and communications. So we'd be looking at how people behave in a one-on-one interview or on a one-on-one conversation, and we just sit as a third person in the back listening to it and analyzing it based on how they interact with each other. One theory that spawned from symbolic interactionalism, or is related or tied to symbolic interactionalism, is label theory. This theory states that society gives labels to people to classify them, to put them into a social class, an economic class, or even to raise or lower them in position in society. So, what are some pros and cons of symbolic interactionalism? Well, some pros might be that it focuses more on quality over quantity of information. So it goes more in depth on individual interviews, asking lots of questions, getting to get a good feel for that person's perspective versus other theories that might be going at a more macro level scale and analyzing things as this social group looks at this, or this racial group, or this class group, or this particular society. It looks at things at a more micro individual rather than the societal level as a whole. The beta category is the micro level, the one-on-one interactions. So it's debated whether or not this is a pro or con. The pro part is that it is the quality over quantity discussion I just mentioned. The con level is on the fact that you don't get as much varied information, as well as the actual con of difficulty of remaining objective, as you're only getting one person's perspective rather than a variety of perspectives. So there may be a level of bias based on that person's experiences, thoughts, or opinions. Other cons can be that it leads to labeling of people into categories and things like that. But other theories also have that same problem, and it is not unique to this theory. Thus, I did not specifically label it on this presentation. But it still bared meaning and thus needed to be mentioned. So, rural versus urban community. The different ways this can be analyzed and looked at on how they are similar and different are on three factors I'll be discussing: labels, levels of communal familiarity, and diversity of perspectives and experiences. So, in a more rural region, the labels are differently placed and what are emphasized or valued versus that of the urban communities. For example, in a more rural area, labels that might be important are hunter, lawman, though that also may apply to urban as well. There's what school you went to. Well, that could also be applied to both as well. And then other ones that are different are farmer versus rancher versus retiree, city folk, city slicker. Yeah, those are examples for more rural labels. Urban examples could be hillbilly, applied to the other group. Backwoods. There are also things like school labels, like these apply to both, that what school you went to, how big the school was, what your mascot was, did you play sports, if you played sports, what sport. Those can be examples of labels that classify people by label theory within the theory of symbolic interactionalism. So, as far as levels of communal familiarity go, this involves like from the rural area where there's fewer people per region or per like school. So the people in that society typically know people a little bit better. They'll recognize people more. Maybe there'll be more interpersonal relationships between the members of that society versus the urban where there is more masses in the area where there's just too many people to know everybody. It's too packed. There's so many people. The schools might be bigger. The schools might have more students per class. For example, of that, you may be less familiar with your professors and teachers than in a more rural area where there might be fewer people per student, for example, on the educational level discussion. For diversity of perspectives and experiences, rural areas, because of the level of communal familiarity, unless somebody brings in more experiences by moving to that region or moving out of that region to someplace else and then coming back, the level of diversity of experiences and perspectives is far more limited than the urban community, where there can be more cultural shifts from street to street than there are in the entire counties of these rural regions, for example. And a good example of this is in St. Paul. There are different districts that host lots of different cultural groups. They're all within the same span as might be one district of schools within a more rural region. There's 4 in the same region in a bigger city. Those are just some examples. So, application. In my future career as a pastor, this could be applied to indicating how to approach people in different regions that you may be preaching in. So, in a more rural region, you'll see more one-on-one interaction, potentially more meals before, after church as community outreach or communication, building the community up together in closeness with conversation and things of that nature on the individual societal level, such as coffee and snacks where we can then congregate and discuss and getting to know people. Whereas in bigger cities, you'll find more people come, go quickly. They're living at a more faster pace often. There may be fewer opportunities to have that same level of communion and outreach with the individuals within one's parish. So that might change how you look at things, how you label things, and how you try to connect with the parish. If you can get to know the parish and understand their social contexts, their experiences, and what they're looking for, it helps you to try to figure out how to connect to this group, how to interact with them, and how you might best serve these people. Because you're there to serve the people and serve God. That is the perspective on that. An example might be in a more urban region, you might be going out and helping public services like soup kitchens, or going to people who can't go to church for their own reasons, be it medical, physical, or other type of situations, and figuring out how you might be able to bring the word to them individually. You could do this for the more rural people too, but this is more of a what institutions are already in place. There are more typically within the more urban communities and rural. And then the rural community, you can have a more come join us, come sit down, have a nice conversation, get to know your church family setting. You can try to apply this to both, but it does not always work depending on the context of these people. So, looking at an example of a situation for how this is applied, I moved in 2014 from Burton, Michigan, which is right next to Flint, Michigan, and all the way up to the northern city, well, calling it a city or even a township is a bit of a stretch, of Frederick. Frederick has a gas station. It now has a church, so it's no longer a hamlet. It's now officially a township. It has 2 bars, a library, a very small one, and yeah, that's about it. It used to have a bakery, but that closed down last year. This is a town that is filled with either farmers or people who are retired. It's very small town vibe, if not just country town vibe. There's more distance between houses than most people in an urban setting might be used to. Housing prices are lower. More property tied to the houses than you might see in a city. So you actually have a yard. So contextual changes for this move was I went from a very diverse region filled with lots of people, different cultures, and certain ways of speaking, as well as different priorities involving holidays and other such things. I ended up experiencing a bit of culture shock because, as a friend in school said, it was kind of a snowflake town, as they say. It was mostly white people, very few not. And one of my first days going to school in the bus, when they asked me where I was from and I told them Flint, the Flint area, they said, "You can't be from Flint, you're white." So there was a different contextual perspective and assumptions and labels placed on different regions based on what they see in media and news. And the different linguistics and interactions were a bit of a culture shock for me. And like I stated above, there was a stark lack of diversity, as I came from a more culturally diverse region and family to a place where very few people weren't white redneck style context, as city folk might say. So what are some possibilities for change based on these theories? If we can limit the institutional labels on the educated or those being educated and those who learn differently, we could limit some of the inequality and discrimination based on those factors. For example, some are tactile learners, some are more reading or audible connection readers. So if we can remove the institutional labels and discrimination against the different styles of learning or paces in which people learn, we can limit some of the inequalities within education. Other things might be lessons on different diverse groups from insiders' perspectives as well. So some of the resources I used involves the Introduction to Sociology 3rd edition, which many of you will be familiar with from Introduction to Sociology if you took the class with Professor Piatti. Other ones include Suburban School Districts and Demographic Change, the Technical, Normative, and Political Dimensions of Response. And I used some information from the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, its website and article. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Have a great day.